Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for attending More Than Forms, Bridging the 10 Steps of Volunteer Screening. My name is Erin, my pronouns are she and her, and I will be your presenter for today. So we're going to go through each of the 10 steps to screening using a relationship-based lens to support your volunteer screening practices. And so please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on our website as well as sent to all of the registrants sometime early next week. So thank you for staying on mute until the end of the presentation, which we will then stop the recording and enter into a question and answer time. And any questions throughout the presentation can be sent into the chat. Graham is here with me, and he's also happy to answer any questions. And if we don't get to all of them, then I'm happy to answer the questions that remain unanswered at our Q&A time. And our next thing on the agenda is our land acknowledgement. So you're welcome to settle in, grab your cup of tea or coffee, and take a deep breath and listen in whatever way suits you best. And here's our land acknowledgement. As Volunteer Alberta continues our ongoing unlearning journey, we see the increasing importance of reflecting on our ties to each other and the land. Our main office is situated on Treaty 6 territory, in an area that holds many Indigenous names but is referred to by the Nea people as Amiskwaciy-Waskahigan, and colonially known as Edmonton. Our staff, board, and work extend beyond into Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 territories. I'm joining you from Treaty 7, and we affirm the importance of honoring these historic agreements as well as all future treaties. The land we call Alberta is the ancestral territory and present-day home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Nehea, Dene, Yare Nakota, Anishinaabe, Niitsitapi, Inuit, and Métis. They have cared for and advocated for the lands, waters, and animals for many generations, despite historical and ongoing harmful actions against their communities. We are grateful for their stewardship of this land, and as an act of reconciliation and goodwill, it is our intention to ensure that our organization, along with the entire social impact, nonprofit, and voluntary sector, can become good partners in supporting the land and communities. So, as we talk about volunteer screening today and going beyond paperwork and diving into relationships, we can look to the land to learn a bit more. The interconnectedness of nature, how they depend on one another, can help frame how we think about screening volunteers in the larger nonprofit sector. We need each other in this ecosystem, both within the context of our organizations and across organizations. Thank you for joining me in our land acknowledgement. So a bit more about Volunteer Alberta. We are a diverse and inclusive member association that aims to nurture conditions for civic engagement and volunteerism in Alberta. And we work with nonprofits across the province as a capacity building and capability nourishing organization. We have multiple programs and services to support nonprofits like yours, including our membership, our resource library, which will include in this webinar, and many other mentioned resources. We also offer customized workshops and educational events, and of course, the volunteer screening program. The volunteer screening program brings you this webinar today as we offer support for volunteer engaging nonprofits to strengthen their volunteer screening efforts. We offer the vulnerable sector check fee waiver. Applications are open all year, so you're welcome to apply at any time if you're in a participating municipality. We have the screening development micro grants that just opened last week, and an email was sent out if you're on our mailing list. And so those applications are open now, which is super exciting. They're open until July 24th. And we also offer learning resources such as this one. The volunteer screening program is in partnership with the Government of Alberta, and we have many free resources in our resource library. But again, we do offer paid educational webinars and workshops that can be catered specifically to your organization's needs. So we'd be happy to chat more with you if there's a question that arises that you want to dive deeper on. Please note that Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice. Rather, we provide general, useful information, and any specific questions, legal questions, you should bring to a legal representative. So if we're going to talk about the 10 steps to screening, it's of course important to have a base understanding of what volunteer screening even is as we talk more about the 10 steps. So volunteer screening is any of the processes you take to define the relationship between the organization and the volunteer to establish safety for everyone impacted by the organization's and the volunteer's work. It's also to ensure that the volunteer has been matched with a role that is meaningful and makes sense for their skill set and aspirations. Volunteer screening is not a one-size-fits-all process. Everyone here today has a different screening process than the person beside them in our theoretical Zoom landscape. As we'll discover in this webinar together, though, there are many ways to approach volunteer screening, such as using a unique combination of the 10 steps to screening, but in a way that makes sense for your unique context. So as opposed to document-based screening, which focuses on the collection of documents like police information checks, reference checks, applications, and so on, relationship-based screening emphasizes empathy, reciprocity, safety, and trust. This is the lens through which Volunteer Alberta looks at volunteer screening. And I bet everyone here today does this to some extent or another. So it's worth noting that document collection isn't wrong or bad, but these are just some of the tools in the volunteer screening toolbox. And also, document collection can be rooted in relationship-based screening, but screening is so much more than some of the documents that you could collect. They're not the only tools, and we emphasize the relationship-based screening to help organizations establish safety and finding that good match, like what I just mentioned, just by understanding motivations and skill sets of the volunteer rather than just checking for extreme examples of perceived bad behavior, like criminal or dishonest behavior. So you can use relationship-based screening as a lens at your own organization to look at each of the screening steps you take to see the ways that you already emphasize empathy, reciprocity, safety, and trust. But it could also help highlight how you could improve on these aspects. For example, not everyone is comfortable, not every volunteer is going to be comfortable filling out an online application form. So it might be helpful for them to have a phone call, or you could offer to meet with them to gain that information through a different path. So we're going to see in the coming 10 steps that the flexibility each one has to offer to both the organization and the volunteer can be utilized when viewed through a relationship-based screening lens. So before we get into the 10 steps, when we're engaging volunteers, it's also important to have a base understanding of important legal concepts that are relevant to all of our organizations. Legal concepts that will apply to everyone's organization are duty of care and standard of care. So when someone in Alberta has a duty of care arising from their employment or volunteer status, courts assess whether they have met that duty by comparing their conduct to what an ordinary, reasonable, and prudent person would do in the same circumstances. So the assessment of reasonableness is fact-specific and considers the probability and severity of foreseeable harm, as well as the cost or burden of preventing injury. Individual volunteers and staff members hold a duty of care, but also the organization as a whole has a duty of care too, which can be addressed through something like the 10 steps. For professionals and those with special skills, the standard of their work is more demanding because they hold themselves as possessing specialized knowledge and must exercise reasonable care, skill, and knowledge appropriate to the role. So, for example, a psychologist who volunteers their time at a recovery center will be held to a higher standard of care than an admin assistant, just as an example. And in Alberta, volunteers in nonprofit organizations receive statutory protection under the Freedom to Care Act. They are not liable for any harm caused by their actions if they are working within the scope of their duties, though they remain liable for willful, reckless, or criminal misconduct or gross negligence. So the Freedom to Care Act doesn't protect organizations from liability, A great place to start with the Freedom to Care Act is just reading the act itself and proceeding from there, just to familiarize yourself with what's out there. And you can find more about the Freedom to Care Act in one of our other free volunteer screening program resources, the Screening Policies Guidebook. That's in our resource library, and you're welcome to take a look at it. But you can also search up the Freedom to Care Act and read the act itself. All right, so the 10 steps of volunteer screening from Volunteer Canada is a resource to help any volunteer engaging organization understand the breakdown of volunteer screening. So it takes it more into bite-sized pieces because it can feel quite overwhelming when we're looking at all of it all at once. We're going to go through each step, explain what it is, each step's goal, and it's all going to be through that relationship-based lens. And I bet everyone here knows something more about relationship-based screening for this step or that step, something that I've never even considered. So you're also welcome to put those insights into the chat. There's so much knowledge in this space already. So thank you again for being here. It's important to note that some organizations will use some of the steps because that's what makes sense for their programming, while others will use all 10. This is just a guideline, but you know your community and programming the best, so you'll know what is going to make sense for your context. We also encourage you to take a look at the outcomes intended by each step of the screening process. So there's a very real possibility you may be achieving many of the intended outcomes without using the same 10 steps described by this presentation. Maybe there's a different step you take that I am unaware of. If so, I would love to hear it. But there's so many ways to do volunteer screening. For example, you may not have a formal reference check process, but your volunteer manager or yourself relies on the community to direct volunteers to your organization. So in that case, the process of volunteer recruitment kind of establishes the same kind of credibility that a reference check process does. So maybe you don't even need to take that step, but more on that later. Number one, my favorite. The first step is a risk assessment. And it's a great place to start or even come back to if you don't know how to move forward. Maybe you're farther along in the screening process, you can always come back here. A risk assessment's goal is to find what risks are inherent to your volunteer program and roles and how you can address them. So regardless of whoever's filling this role or that role, you know that there's these risks, regardless of who's filling in them. Including, you can also use a risk assessment to adjust current strategies that you already have, like policies out there or how you train volunteers, and of course, the screening steps you take. Maybe you do risk assessment and you realize, oh, maybe we don't need to do all these steps because it doesn't match with the amount of risk that's there. Or maybe we need to add a couple, and it could look like this. So in practice, a risk assessment looks like a state of mind. In other words, the risk assessment process is continuous and it should be embedded throughout all of your screening practices. We're always going to be asking ourselves then, how can we be on the lookout for current and potential risks so that we can plan to mitigate them? Again, it goes back to that relationship and building that reciprocity and trust. So volunteers can know that you're always looking out for them. So if you find yourself, again, stuck on step 5 or stuck on step 8 and something feels off, or you feel like maybe this could be safer, you can always come back to a risk assessment. When you do identify a possible or current risk, you can use the other 10 steps to help address it. So you could, again, add in something like step 4, an application form to better understand who the volunteer is. But again, more on that later. We're going to go through all 10 steps. So again, the risk assessment is like a state of mind that is ongoing. And again, I see this all the time. People go, what is a risk assessment? And oftentimes people are already thinking like this. It's just adding language to how people think. Even just going, oh, we're coaching soccer this summer, so it's good to have band-aids on site because there could be scraped knees and such. That's a an example of a risk assessment. So everyone here does that to some extent or another, and there's always room for improvement, and there's always the possibility that we can ask better questions of how we can mitigate risk. So you'll see throughout this presentation, we have listed a bunch of resources for you. Anything that's underlined, you'll see is free. You can access through our resource library, so all through the Volunteer Alberta website. And I'll make sure to link the resource library to all registered registrants so that you can access any of these resources. They're also all linked in the slide deck. But you're welcome to use those to your advantage. And you'll see too, some of the resources are for members. But we have many free resources that are public and for you to use at your own organization. The resources here I'd like to highlight, though, if you're not sure where to start, are the risk assessment matrices. So there's in-person and virtual ones, and then the risk assessment checklist, which is a template for you to use. If you don't know where to start, using these two resources combined is a great place to start because you'll start seeing visually where everything's kind of lying, and maybe there's some gaps, like literally gaps on the page that you can go, oh, we should fill that. Great places to start. And then there's so many more. So you can look into the webinars, those dive into the risk assessments even more. But if you don't know where to go, start with these first two on the slide here. I also want to highlight that there's many ways to do a risk assessment that these slides could never get through if I had all the time in the world. It could look like, again, going through some of these resources, but it could and should also look like having conversation with the beneficiaries of your organization, having those relationships. Ask the volunteers what could be changed so you feel safer. How can we support you better? I'm just a text away. If you see something that maybe you don't feel comfortable with, or you have an idea on how to make that feel safer, please just send me an email, give me a call, whatever. I'm always open to that. That's what that could look like. You could do a survey as well. That's a great one. You could do a focus group. You could have coffee combos or phone calls. A multifaceted approach, though, will always help you cover more ground to care well for your community. There's great places to start, but there's so many avenues forward, and the more we can combine those different types of risk assessments can benefit your organization and everyone involved. Step two is position descriptions. This is when you'll write meaningful, complete, and accurate descriptions of the volunteer role. And the goal with position descriptions is to clarify for both the volunteer and the organization what the purpose of the role is and identify what's needed operationally to set everyone up for success. So things you need to have in your position description include your mission and vision, your tasks, time commitment, required skills, the screening steps the volunteer needs to take, a brief description of the role itself, maybe a paragraph or a couple of point form notes, and then any other need to know info that's unique to that role. Tasks are very important to include and communicate to volunteers to ensure they are covered under the Freedom to Care Act. So that's, again, a great place to start if you feel overwhelmed with writing a position description. Just start with the tasks and make sure those are communicated. Your risk assessment is also going to help you write your position descriptions. Again, you can always go back to step one. And if there's a higher risk for a certain role, you might be able to mitigate those risks through additional screening steps, like requiring a certain type of training. And then you can include that in the position description. It shouldn't be lengthy, around 1 to 2 pages max. My rule for myself was 1.5, absolutely the max. I don't know if I always met that goal, but regardless, it needs to clearly set expectations and responsibilities. And you could also always have a more detailed version for internal use, and then a shorter one for recruitment that you have at volunteer fairs to put on the table. There's no right way to do it, but there's, again, certain things that we can think about when we're thinking about relationship and safety and building that trust. Some resources, the Developing Volunteer Positions webinar that you see there, that again, free up for everyone to access. That will go through each of those elements that I just talked about in more depth. And then there's the position description risk assessment template, and it kind of combines step one and two. So it's a really great opportunity to use that template to see what the volunteer is doing and see what risks are involved in that role. So again, no right way to do these 10 steps. Sometimes you combine steps, sometimes you skip around. That's totally fine. So notice we're not even recruiting until step three. Uh, the goal here is to find volunteers who will be successful in the role, find it meaningful, and also able to support your programming through developing fair and consistent selection systems. So it's really necessary to include important information when you're promoting the role. Your organization's mission or vision should absolutely be in that promotion material, and also what the role even is, what they're signing up for. Even if it's just a shortened version of what they'll be doing, who knows, it could hook a certain reader, and then you can share more about what it looks like in practice. Recruitment can be formal, so job boards, posters, social media campaigns, and informal, word of mouth, recruiting friends and family. But we do know from the 2023 Survey of Albertans from the government of Alberta that most people hear about volunteer opportunities from friends, family, and neighbors. So if you're focusing your volunteer program around relationship where there's trust, there's reciprocity, and the volunteer feels safe at your organization and knows that they're being taken care of, that their role is meaningful, then how much more likely are they going to bring their loved ones along? That's how I look at it, and that is how I notice higher levels of engagement long term. If you are putting ads anywhere or posting on social media, make sure the information is up to date. So ensure they're regularly reviewed. You can keep a list of where you've posted everything just to ensure that they can be updated when necessary. And we highly recommend that you advertise specific jobs and roles based on the audience you are trying to reach. So Instagram might have a bit of a different audience than Facebook, for example. And for some folks, recruitment might not come until later on in the process once you've gone through all 10 steps and figured out, yeah, this is how we want to run this process. And you kind of have to go through all the 10 steps before we start talking to people because they're going to have questions about what's coming later. But again, recruitment can be an ongoing thing, but it's good to have some plans in place before you start recruiting. Here are some resources here. A great place to start is the one at the bottom. Again, free for anyone to access on our website. How do I get more volunteers and why is that the wrong question? That was a webinar we did in partnership with the Edmonton Chamber of Voluntary Organizations, and there's incredible insights in there. Great place to start. All of these, I think, have insights for every organization. Okay, number 4, application forms. An application form helps you gain necessary information about the volunteer to help guide them through the screening process. So it's important to really consider each question that you put into an application form too. Don't use information that can be seen as being used to discriminate against protected areas of the Canadian Human Rights Act. For example, race, religion, sex, age, family status, etc. Don't ask for information that isn't necessary for them to fulfill their volunteer role either. So, for example, you don't have to ask for a birth date unless absolutely necessary. Instead, you can ask, are you 18 years or older if you need to have a certain age? If you'd like to know birthdays for recognition or celebration reasons, create a form that they can optionally fill out during onboarding, for example. There's always a risk of cyber attacks, or if you're still using paper copies, that's totally fine, but there's always a risk then that maybe that winds up in the wrong hands, or it's on the side of your desk and somebody sees it who perhaps shouldn't be privy to that information. And that could always compromise your files like application forms if you're there paper or online. And that puts the volunteer at risk too, as well as your organization. So make it concise and make it make sense for your organization and for the volunteer. Some resources we have. We have a couple of resources for developing application forms. You can watch the volunteer recruitment and hiring webinar. That will touch on multiple of the 10 steps. And the window of work is a great tool to use if you're kind of starting from scratch with the application form or would like to um, maybe edit or update your application form. And what it does is it outlines what it asks the volunteer or whoever why they're passionate about the mission and vision, what they envision themselves doing, what they hope to gain, and tasks that they're interested in doing. And then you could use the window of work and then ask for their name and contact information. And that might be a great place to start with your application form. So we've gained all that information from the application. Now, if your organization deems it necessary, then it's an interview. You'll want to have developed specific questions for a volunteer interview before you go into it. Um, you'll also want to get to know the volunteer and provide information on the organization role and answer any questions during a volunteer interview. It's also always a helpful reminder the volunteer is interviewing you as well. So maybe that's a great time to share just why you're passionate about the mission and vision, or show them a bit more about what makes you excited about the role that they're applying for. But it's about reciprocity too in an interview. So one of the ways I've seen that relationship-based screening play out with an interview is just calling it a conversation, or it's just I want to get to know you more so I can find the best match for you. Would you be open to a phone call? It could look like many different things. Nonetheless, step five is an interview. And so by the time you're interviewing volunteers, again, that system should already be developed and that process already developed, just so that each volunteer is treated fairly and information is accurately tracked and safely stored. When making your interview questions, just like with the application questions, ask yourself, why do we ask for these specific questions and what do we do with each answer? And if you can't find a clear answer to those questions, like I don't know why we ask them for their favorite color, then it might be the best option to skip that question and gives the volunteers some of their time back. You don't want to ask inappropriate questions either, or questions that are irrelevant for the role. For example, where's your family from, or do you have kids? And again, same for the application form. Some interview resources. Again, that volunteer recruitment and hiring webinar is going to touch on multiple of these screening steps. So that's a great place to start. And then we have some resources for members as well. One step that you might want to take, depending on your insurance and also your organizational requirements, is conducting reference checks to confirm skills, knowledge, and past behavior to ensure a good match with the role and organization. Just need to plug my computer in. I realize it unplugged. There we go. So keep in mind that references can sometimes create barriers, especially for youth and newcomers to volunteer. Volunteer Connectors' and anti-racist approach to volunteering showed that BIPOC individuals on average felt reference checks were more of a barrier than for non-BIPOC folks. Newcomers might not even have someone to call upon to be their reference. Reference checks are likely not even necessary in the first place. With thoughtful processes like interviews and supervision, you'll get a good idea if the person is a good match for the role pretty quickly. And I always said to myself, I didn't want to do references. I wanted to spend time talking to the volunteers themselves, hearing their feedback, supporting them, showing up to their shifting and seeing what awesome stuff they have going on, and having conversations even just about how they're doing and how do they feel like they're fitting into the organization, and what is making them happy about the role, all of that. So I wanted to give back to the volunteers. But whether or not you choose to check references, ensure they are in accordance with predetermined position requirements and that they comply with your insurance policy. Again, all of the 10 steps, it's a guideline. Number 7, this is a big one. Background checks. Background checks confirm that the volunteer does not have a criminal record. That's what it's looking for. A criminal record may indicate a risk for certain responsibilities and tasks. Certain responsibilities and tasks, not necessarily every task and every role at your organization. Background checks are also a way for an organization to fulfill its duty of care, just with like several of the other steps. But you need to make sure to assess the risks associated with a specific position to determine whether or not a background check is required. Not all roles automatically need one, and some may not need a certain type of check, but they need another specific type of check. There's multiple different types of background checks you can conduct. It's then your responsibility to know what you are asking for from the volunteers engaged at your organization. So make sure to review information from background check reports as it relates to the requirements of the specific volunteer assignment, and blanket screening for a variety of roles that all do different things, different responsibilities, different tasks, that likely doesn't consider the different levels of risks or tasks. That's when we go back to step one risk assessment and see what the risk is there and see what balances out that risk. Sometimes it's too heavy on the screening and got to pull back, or we need to be more thoughtful about our screening and change some of the steps around. That's why we can always go back to step one, for example. You also need to know what information you are gaining from obtaining a volunteer's background check if you are asking for them. There are multiple forms of non-conviction records that can show up on a background check. For example, making a 911 call or being involved in a police investigation as a witness can show up on a volunteer's background check, but it might not even specify that it was a 911 call. It just might say that the positive search was found. Zero tolerance policies don't consider the other possibilities of having a positive search on your background check. And so there might be a wonderful person who's so excited to volunteer, and that background check eliminates them from the process. That is heartbreaking to think about. So not only to mention if somebody does have a criminal record, but for example, if it was a conviction that happened years or decades ago, that doesn't mean that they're not a safe person and they can't volunteer. The most common types of background checks that we see organizations obtaining include a police information check, a PIC, a vulnerable sector check, a VSC, which is an additional search to a police information check to confirm the applicant does not have a record suspension for sexual offenses, and a child intervention check. All of these search different databases with some overlap some of the time. That means, however, that each one is going to get you different information. These are also not to be confused with another check we see a lot of, a criminal record check, which RCMP and third parties conduct and search, and only indicates if there is a criminal record or if there isn't a criminal record. That is so much information. I know it's so overwhelming. But then that's when you go back to your policies and what your organization looks for and go, oh, we're looking for that police information check. Okay, let me understand more about that police information check. And how to even read a police information check, as an example. Depending on the type of background check you're asking for, make sure it is in compliance with your insurance policy. Your insurance policy might require that there's certain types of background checks. And then, of course, any relevant legislation, which some of them I list here. Early learning and childcare regulation, that's where it states that volunteers that have unsupervised access would require a new criminal record check, including a vulnerable sector check, once every 3 years. But volunteers who have a child registered in the program may request from the director that they are exempted from a record check. The Protection for Persons in Care Act is where it states that volunteers undergo a criminal records check. It does not indicate a VSC is required. In fact, the exact wording can be interpreted that only volunteers who provide care or support services need a CRC, a criminal record check, but that, again, it's open for interpretation. Here's what it says, and I quote, "Every service provider shall require every successful applicant for employment, every new volunteer, and every person to be engaged for services by the service provider to provide care or support services to undergo a criminal records check. And the Criminal Records Act explains how record suspensions are kept separate from regular criminal records. And 6.1 explains how records of discharges shall not be disclosed after 1 year after absolute discharge or 3 years after conditional discharge, and also defines a vulnerable person and outlines under what conditions a record suspension may be reviewed. And lastly, the Youth Criminal Justice Act. This limits the disclosure of youth record information and what may or may not show up on their background check. So maybe you're asking a youth for a background check. It might be redundant depending on what is allowed to even show up there. I don't have all this memorized. It's so much to memorize. And if you're feeling like, wow, that's a lot to learn, I totally get it. But it's when we go back to our policy and we go, oh, we're asking for this type of check, or maybe the language is unclear here. Why am I asking for this type of check? And can I explain to the volunteer who is going to be screened into this role why it's necessary and what the process is? If something shows up, if something doesn't show up, it's okay. There's so many ways to do it, but it's just being thoughtful about the processes and putting and looking at it through that relationship. It doesn't mean that just because there is a positive result that they are unsafe or not a good match. Oh, okay. So we have even more resources on this. If you're feeling a little overwhelmed, that's totally fine. Great place to start. Do I need a vulnerable sector check? That's like a 12-minute webinar. So that's a great place to start. And then if you're wanting to get more details about what I just talked about and what could show up on a background check, the Navigating Background Checks webinar is excellent at diving in and breaking all of that down. If you feel like a pro and you're like, yeah, I got this, a great place to go next is the Check Yourself VSP Background Check game show, because that can kind of test your knowledge and see where you're at. And it's a fun little game. So, and then we, of course, have different templates, and we also have guidebooks to help you form policies around background checks. All of those are free to access, all of them listed on this slide. So you're welcome to access those at any time through our resource library. Number 8, orientation and training. Steps 8, 9, and 10 are the post-hiring phase of the screening process. And screening isn't just about getting the volunteers signed up and in the doors, it's about ongoing engagement to set the volunteer and your organization up for success. Screening never really ends. Again, screening is about safety and ensuring a good match for the volunteer and the organization. A volunteer might seem like a great match for a certain role, but then they get to training and realize that it's not for them and they'd like to explore a different role. That's totally fine. Orientation and training will clarify information about the mission, vision, values, and policies of the organization, and also the specific tasks and procedures and scope of the position that they're fulfilling. The goal here is to ensure the volunteer is set up for success through proper understanding of expectations, policies, procedures, where to go if they have feedback, who to communicate to, and also how to seek support when they need it. So some of these 10 steps can be optional, but I would recommend that every volunteer needs at least some kind of orientation to the position and organization, even if it's just, they're showing up to fold clothes. It's just showing up and it's a 5-minute orientation. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Erin. I am your point person. You're welcome to contact me at any time. This is our mission and vision. This is why it's important that we have our wonderful volunteers folding clothes. That's how it fits into our mission and vision. Here is some access to coffee and water, bathrooms, and this is where you'll be working. I'll be right around the corner if you need me. Thanks so much for being here. That's all it can be, and that's an orientation. There's also really awesome like full-length orientations out there, but again, you know the roles and what they need. Some other roles, though, will need more formal and in-depth training on top of an orientation, and you'll know what those roles are. And sometimes too, a certain volunteer comes in so skilled and knowing exactly what needs to be done. They've done it before, they have the skills. And so then you can be flexible. You don't need to sit them through 2 hours of training of everything they know. It's just like call me if you have any questions about the specific processes that we do. Here's an outline of it. It could look like anything. But again, look at double check with your insurance policy if there's anything there and organizational policies as well. But there's so much flexibility within something like an orientation and training. I'd recommend the onboarding and welcoming volunteers webinar, again, free for everyone. And that's going to go through, it's going to touch on several of the steps, but especially step 8. Number 9, support and supervision. This is going to be ongoing throughout the volunteer. This is also another throughout the volunteer role. This one also kind of never stops or ends. You'll want to maintain an ongoing relationship with the volunteer to ensure that they stay engaged and feel like a respected part of your team. And if it's not you, then it's another staff member, or maybe there's another volunteer who is really great at leading other volunteers. It could be multiple people. Ongoing support and supervision will also ensure that safety steps are being taken and that the volunteer remains a good match for the role. Maybe somebody's life situation changes and they don't have the schedule that works with the volunteer role. Maybe you can readjust the volunteer role or find another role for them that they like and works with their life. Or maybe they have all these awesome skills and want to keep growing and take on more responsibility or whatever that looks like. Those are things that we can know through adequate support and supervision and having those conversations and following up with them and communicating well. We also have a volunteer re-engagement webinar. That was a really interesting research project that Volunteer Alberta did that touches on and provides insights into support and supervision. And finally, we're on to step 10, follow-up and feedback. Although it is technically the 10th step, again, this is something that you will always be doing. The goal is to ensure that the people your programs serve, including volunteers, program participants, staff, and also any other beneficiaries of the organization feel safe. They feel respected, and they are supported properly through the use of volunteers. Follow-up and feedback can look like a formal annual survey. It can look like a phone call check-in after somebody's first week of volunteering. It could be a focus group. How can we improve our volunteer program? I've noticed you are super passionate about our organization and your volunteer role. Would you like to come be a part of that? Or anything at all that suits your volunteer program. It could be a combination of everything. Or maybe you love to go to Tim's and have the catch up and hear about somebody's experience. I love doing that. There's so many ways to do follow up and feedback. And just like all the other 9 steps, there's no right way to do it. There's so much flexibility and you can contextualize it to your own unique needs and organizational needs. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for being here at the first of many More Than Forms. You are always welcome to email us at screening@volunteeralberta.ab.ca. If you're registered, you got an email from me earlier, so you'll see my email, CC, but also the screening email, which my team and I monitor. You can also give us a call. I'd love to chat more if there's a question that came up today or you'd like to offer any insights that you think I can learn from. I'm always looking to hear what's going on in the community. That's my extension and phone number there. And if there was somebody that you know who wasn't able to make it today, not to worry, we're offering the same session again in August, October, December, and February. And this recording, again, will also be sent to all registrants. If you'd like to dive deeper into anything you've heard today and you think your organization, or maybe there's a bunch of volunteer leaders or the board at your organization could benefit from anything we talked about, we would love to set up a time to chat with you to do additional training and learning. So that brings us to the end of More Than Forms. I'm just gonna stop sharing.